The Phantom Train. Hello friends, welcome to the Horror Ghost Stories. The story begins. On a foggy evening, the quiet town of Glenmuir sat eerily still, its streets bathed in the pale glow of street lamps. The residents were mostly inside, curled up with their families, unaware of the dark events unfolding just outside the town's edge. In the distance, a faint sound of rumbling could be heard, barely audible above the rustling of the wind. It was the sound of a train that should never have been there. Local lore had long whispered about the Phantom Train, a cursed locomotive that would occasionally appear along the tracks near Glenmuir, traveling at impossible speeds. The legend claimed that the train was carrying the souls of the lost, passengers who had died under mysterious circumstances, doomed to ride eternally through the night. Some dismissed it as a mere myth, a ghost story told to scare children, but those who had encountered it knew better. One such person was Mark, a young man who had just moved to Glenmuir, eager to start a new life away from the hustle of the city. He had heard the stories, but being a skeptic, he brushed them off as nothing more than exaggerations. That evening, while taking a stroll near the tracks to clear his mind, Mark heard the unmistakable sound of a train whistle. It was sharp and haunting, piercing the silence of the night. He paused, looking down the track, but saw nothing. The fog was thick, obscuring any sign of movement. Curiosity got the better of him. Mark ventured closer to the edge of the tracks, trying to peer through the mist. The rumbling grew louder, now accompanied by the distinct sound of wheels screeching against metal. His heart raced as the air grew cold and damp, a chill creeping up his spine. Then, out of the fog, it appeared a massive train, its headlights dim but glowing with an unnatural, flickering light. The train seemed to glide rather than roll, moving too smoothly for something of its size. Mark's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet were frozen to the ground. The train passed by at an impossible speed, its cars rattling and shaking. Inside, through the grimy windows, Mark glimpsed figures, pale, motionless faces staring back at him. The passengers were dressed in tattered clothes, their eyes wide open, yet unseeing. It was as if they were not alive, but trapped in a state between worlds. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed in the distance, and the train vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the thick fog and the sound of Mark's pounding heart. He stood there, in shock, unsure of what he had just witnessed. He wanted to believe it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, but deep down, he knew what he had seen was real. The Phantom Train was not a myth. Mark's obsession with the train grew. He couldn't shake the images of the ghostly passengers or the sense of foreboding that had filled the air. Over the next few days, he researched the town's history, digging through old newspaper articles and speaking to longtime residents. What he discovered sent a chill down his spine. The first report of the Phantom Train had surfaced decades ago, after a tragic accident on the tracks. A passenger train had collided with another, killing everyone on board. The survivors spoke of strange occurrences leading up to the crash, whispers in the wind, shadowy figures on the tracks, and the feeling of being watched. Some claimed they saw the train before it even reached the station, a ghostly vision that seemed to foreshadow the disaster. In the years that followed, the train would appear sporadically, each time in the dead of night, its passengers always the same ghosts of those who perished in the crash. Determined to uncover the truth, Mark returned to the tracks one more time. The fog had rolled in thicker than before, and the night was eerily quiet. He stood by the tracks, waiting, his heart pounding in his chest. The train had to come again. It was only a matter of time. As the minutes ticked by, Mark's mind raced. What was the Phantom Train? Was it some kind of twisted afterlife, or was it a warning? His thoughts were interrupted by the now familiar sound of the train whistle, faint at first, then louder, closer. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and the fog parted just enough for him to see the glowing headlights pierce through the mist. There it was again, the phantom train. This time, Mark was ready. He stepped onto the tracks, determined to confront whatever haunted that train. But as he did, something strange happened. The train didn't slow down. Instead, it seemed to speed up, rushing toward him with terrifying speed. He stood frozen, paralyzed with fear, unable to move. The train's blinding lights washed over him, and for a brief moment, Mark could swear he saw the faces of the passengers, their eyes wide and filled with terror. Then, in the blink of an eye, the train was gone, and Mark was left standing alone in the silence of the night. His legs buckled, and he fell to the ground, his body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The train had not hit him, but something had changed. The air felt heavier, and the fog seemed thicker, as though the very essence of the night had swallowed him whole. As Mark stumbled to his feet, he heard a whisper, soft and chilling, coming from behind him. "You're one of us now," the voice murmured. Mark spun around, but there was no one there. The tracks were empty. Yet, deep within his soul, he knew the truth. He had joined the passengers of the phantom train. From that night on, Mark's face became one of the many ghostly figures visible through the grimy windows, forever trapped on the train that would never stop. The residents of Glenmoor would continue to hear the whistle on foggy nights, unaware that the man they once knew had become part of the haunting legend, a warning for those who dared to venture too close to the cursed tracks. And so, the phantom train continued its endless journey, carrying the souls of the lost, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of its passing and the chilling reminder that some stories are far more than just tales, they are curses that never fade. The town of Glenmoor, a quiet place nestled between rolling hills and thick forests, was no stranger to strange happenings. But the phantom train was unlike anything else. It was said to be a ghostly locomotive, an apparition that roamed the tracks in the dead of night, bringing with it a sense of foreboding that hung over the town like a dark cloud. Most of the townsfolk would avoid talking about it, brushing it off as an old superstition meant to scare children. But for those who had seen it, the legend was all too real. Mark, new to Glenmoor and keen on starting a fresh chapter in his life, had dismissed the rumors at first. He had heard stories of haunted places before, stories that seemed to belong more to a campfire than the real world. Yet, the more he settled into the town, the more he found himself drawn to the mysteries that surrounded it. One evening, after hearing the legend of the phantom train from a friendly but nervous shopkeeper, Mark decided to investigate. After all, how could a train haunt an entire town if it didn't have a tangible explanation? That fateful evening, Mark had been walking down the quiet, fog-covered streets when he noticed a familiar chill in the air. The fog had rolled in unexpectedly, thick and dense, obscuring the view of the town's outskirts. His curiosity tugged at him. The train tracks were only a short walk from the main street, and tonight seemed as good a time as any to check them out. He shrugged off any unease, convincing himself it was just an old ghost story. As Mark approached the tracks, the air grew colder still, and he noticed an odd stillness that surrounded him. The typical sounds of the town, the rustle of leaves in the trees, distant chatter, the hum of electricity had all vanished, leaving a suffocating silence. Even the faint sound of his footsteps seemed to be swallowed by the fog. Then, in the distance, he heard it. A soft, distant whistle, like the call of a train far off on the horizon. Mark's heart skipped a beat. Could it be he had heard that there were still freight trains that passed through Glenmoor, though rarely at night. Still, something about the sound unsettled him. He paused, his breath visible in the frigid air, and looked down the tracks, but the fog had grown so thick that he couldn't see past the first few feet. The whistle came again, louder this time, accompanied by the unmistakable rumble of a train's engine. Mark's eyes widened in confusion. This was no ordinary train. It sounded like it was coming directly toward him, and yet, he could see nothing through the fog. He felt a chill run down his spine, and before he could react, the train appeared out of the mist, its headlights casting a flickering, ghostly glow across the fog. Mark could hardly believe his eyes. The train was enormous, with old-fashioned carriages that appeared to be from a bygone era. The engine was black and gleaming, with rusted accents that seemed to be decaying even as it moved. The train glided smoothly along the tracks, far too fast to be a normal train. He could hear the clattering of its wheels, the screeching of metal against metal, but there was no sign of a conductor or crew. The train's movement was almost unnatural. It didn't seem to be powered by a typical engine. Instead, it moved with an eerie grace, floating as if it existed outside the laws of physics. The sound of the whistle echoed in the air, sharper and more haunting with every passing second. Mark stepped back instinctively, his mind racing, but his legs refused to move. Through the grime-covered windows of the train, he saw them hundreds of faces staring back at him. Pale, ghostly faces, their eyes wide open but empty, their expressions frozen in eternal fear. Some were pressed against the glass, others sitting motionless in their seats, all dressed in ragged clothing, their bodies decayed with age. But the one thing that unified them was the look in their eyes, terror, confusion, and despair. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run, to scream, but his body betrayed him. He was paralyzed with fear as the train continued to glide toward him, its headlights now blinding. For a split second, he thought he saw a shadowy figure in the conductor's compartment, a figure so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. The train sped past him, and with it, a gust of cold wind hit Mark like a slap. The world around him seemed to shudder, and the train's passage left an unsettling silence in its wake. Mark stood frozen, his body trembling with the realization that he had just witnessed something otherworldly, something that could not be explained by any rational means. As the train disappeared into the mist, Mark slowly regained control of his body. His legs were weak, and he stumbled backward. He knew he had seen the phantom train. The legends were true. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all, but he couldn't. There was no explanation that could fit. The next few days were a blur. Mark couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The image of the ghostly passengers haunted him, and the sound of the train's whistle echoed in his mind. He returned to the tracks, hoping to find some explanation, but each time he arrived, there was no sign of the train. The fog had lifted, and the town seemed peaceful once again. But Mark could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him. It was as if the phantom train had marked him, and it was only a matter of time before it came for him again. Determined to uncover the truth, Mark began asking questions. The locals were hesitant to talk about it, but an elderly woman named Agnes, who had lived in Glenmoor her entire life, finally told him the story. She spoke of a terrible train accident that had occurred many years ago, a collision between two trains that had killed dozens of people. The victims of the crash had been left in a state of limbo, their souls unable to move on. It was said that their restless spirits had boarded the phantom train, which now wandered the tracks, seeking to collect more souls to join its cursed ride. Agnes warned Mark to stay away from the tracks, but it was too late. Mark's curiosity had already led him too far, and the phantom train had already claimed him. No one could escape its grasp once it had marked you. On his final night, Mark returned to the tracks, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he was about to face whatever lay beyond. As the fog crept in and the train whistle sounded again, louder than ever, Mark knew that he couldn't outrun the inevitable. The train would come for him, just as it had come for so many others. When the train appeared, Mark stepped onto the tracks, his legs shaking but determined. He wanted to understand what it felt like, to face the inevitable head-on. The train barreled toward him, its ghostly passengers staring out at him with hollow eyes. At the last moment, Mark closed his eyes, bracing for impact. But instead of pain, he felt a cold rush of air. When he opened his eyes, he was standing at the edge of the tracks, watching as the train sped past, its ghostly passengers still staring at him with unblinking eyes. He had become one of them. From that night forward, Mark's face became another of the many trapped in the train. He was no longer alive, but not quite dead. He was a passenger now, bound to ride the phantom train for eternity, unable to escape the curse that had claimed him. His once familiar town of Glenmuir now seemed like a distant memory, and he was forever lost to the train that roamed the tracks, its passengers cursed to ride forever. And so, the phantom train continued its journey, collecting souls, and leaving behind only the lingering sound of its whistle. The legend of the phantom train had always been shrouded in mystery, whispered across generations in hushed tones. It was a story that had become deeply embedded in the culture of Glenmuir, though its origins were as hazy as the fog that often blanketed the town. The train, it was said, appeared at the stroke of midnight on nights when the moon was hidden, when the air hung heavy with a sense of dread. It was a cursed locomotive that appeared out of the mist, gliding effortlessly along the tracks, carrying with it the souls of the damned. Each ghostly figure trapped within it was a reminder of a life lost too soon, or a fate that had somehow been sealed by dark forces. Over the years, the townspeople had become accustomed to the occasional eerie occurrences tied to the train's passing, the inexplicable cold fronts that would sweep in, the peculiar whispers on the wind, and the strange electrical disturbances that seemed to precede its arrival. No one truly understood how the train could appear and vanish at will, or why it seemed so focused on Glenmuir. But one thing was certain, the train never came without a cost. Mark's first encounter with the phantom train had been shocking, but he never could have imagined the toll it would take on him. After that fateful night when he had seen the train glide past him, with the ghostly faces pressed against the windows, Mark had tried to convince himself that it was a figment of his imagination, an overactive mind playing tricks on him in the cold fog. But every time he tried to sleep, the image of those dead, staring eyes would haunt him. It wasn't just a haunting image, it was a call, a summons that he couldn't ignore. The next few days became a blur. He couldn't focus on anything, he felt as if something was pulling at him, drawing him back to the tracks. The town seemed to close in on him, as though the fog had invaded not just the streets, but his very mind. Everywhere he went, people looked at him strangely, as though they knew something he didn't. It wasn't until he visited Agnes that the truth began to unravel in a way he couldn't have anticipated. Agnes had been a young girl when the train accident had occurred. She had grown up hearing the tragic story from her parents and neighbors. According to her, the accident had taken place during a storm, on a night when the moon had been obscured by dark clouds, just as Mark had seen on the night of his encounter. Two trains had collided on the same tracks, one carrying travelers and the other a shipment of goods. The crash had claimed the lives of all the passengers, but what the authorities couldn't explain was that there had been no sign of anyone trying to stop the trains, no warning signals flashing to alert the engineers. It was as though the trains had been pulled toward each other by some invisible force. The aftermath had been devastating for the town. The wreckage of the trains had been cleared away, but the souls of the victims had remained trapped in the area. The survivors, those who had managed to escape by some miracle, reported seeing strange lights, hearing the sounds of a train in the distance, even when no train had passed through the town. It wasn't long before the whispers began. The souls of the victims hadn't passed on. They were bound to the train, condemned to ride it for eternity, reliving their final moments over and over again. Agnes's grandmother had been one of the first to witness the phantom train. She claimed to have seen it glide through the fog late at night, the train's lights flickering like dying stars. But what struck her most was the sense of helplessness she felt as she watched it pass. She had seen the faces of the dead through the windows, some of whom had been her own relatives. It was then that the curse of the phantom train was born, a warning for the townsfolk: never stray too close to the tracks, for the train would claim anyone who did. After hearing Agnes's story, Mark was shaken. The idea that the train was somehow tied to an event that had happened long before his arrival in Glenmuir made the whole situation even more terrifying. But what haunted him more than the ghostly passengers or the cursed train was the sensation that he had somehow been marked. His life, it seemed, was now entwined with the fate of the phantom train. For days, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time he passed the tracks, he felt a cold breeze stir, and the hairs on the back of his neck would stand on end. It was as though the train was calling to him, beckoning him to come closer. The town had grown quieter, and the once bustling streets of Glenmuir seemed to have lost their vibrancy. Even the shops and homes seemed more desolate, as though the very essence of the town had been drained. It was as if the phantom train's presence had seeped into the town, creeping through the cracks of its walls. One night, Mark could no longer resist the pull. The sound of the train's whistle echoed in the distance, and Mark, against all reason, found himself walking toward the tracks again. The fog had rolled in thicker than ever, swallowing up the street lights and blurring the path ahead. The air was cold, and he could taste the dampness in his breath. As he neared the tracks, the rumble of the train grew louder, like a warning. He should have turned back, but his feet continued to carry him forward. Then, through the mist, he saw its lights barely visible at first, but growing brighter with every passing second. The phantom train was coming. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, his instincts screaming at him to run. But he couldn't. He was rooted to the spot, drawn to the train, unable to break free. This time, as the train drew closer, Mark saw something different. Among the ghostly faces pressed against the windows, he recognized a few. There was the old woman from the general store, her eyes wide in terror. There was the young boy he had seen playing in the streets just days before, and there, staring out with an expression of resigned acceptance, was Mark himself. The realization hit him like a thunderclap: he was one of them. He had become part of the train's eternal journey. The moment the train passed, Mark felt a strange sensation wash over him. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, and the air felt heavy, as though the fog had wrapped itself around him. He stumbled forward, his body shaking with the chilling realization that he was no longer entirely human. His reflection in the window of the train was a confirmation of his fate. He had joined the ranks of the souls trapped aboard the phantom train, bound to ride its tracks forever. The next morning, the town of Glenmuir awoke to another foggy day. The streets were as quiet as they had been the night before, but Mark was no longer seen on those streets. His face, like so many others, had become a part of the train, forever riding its cursed rails. Time seemed to lose its meaning for Mark as he became one of the many souls trapped in the spectral carriages of the phantom train. Every night, as the train slid through the fog, the ghostly passengers would gaze out the windows, trapped in their own eternal nightmare, unable to escape the torment of their fate. And so, the legend of the phantom train grew stronger, passed from generation to generation as a warning. It was not just a tale to frighten children, it was a curse that could ensnare anyone who dared to get too close. Mark, like the others before him, would forever remain a part of the train's endless journey, his face joining the ranks of the dead who rode the train, cursed to carry their souls on a ride that would never end. The end.